All right. So the methods that you can develop the schedule with, the first one that we're going to talk about is critical path. Now, this is the one that probably is the most likely to be on the exam. Critical path is a method where you determine the longest path in the network. You've got this network diagram and you want to figure out what the longest path is. And that will tell you or answer the question, how many days or whatever your increment is this project is. So it is the longest path through the network, and it also determines the shortest amount of time to complete the project. Which, if you read that, it's kind of confusing, but it basically says, like, if you add up the longest path and it's 20 days, what's the shortest amount of time you can complete the project? 20 days. If the longest duration adds up to 20, then you can't do it in less than 20. So that's where that definition comes into play. The easiest way to find the critical path is basically to identify, first, all the paths on the network. So when you have a network diagram, it's not just one line of activities. It could be 50 lines of activities. And so you're going to identify all the possible paths that take you from start to finish, and then look at the durations of all those paths and figure out what the longest path is, and that's the critical path. And we're going to do a couple of exercises on that to drive that home as we go through. Within your network, you can also have something called a near critical path. Now, near critical path is the path that's, in your opinion, closest to the critical path. So if your critical path, let's say, is 20 days, and you have another path in your network that's 19 days, well, 19 days is only one day less than 20, so that's going to be classified as a near critical path. But if, let's say, it was only 17 days, could you classify it as a near critical path? Absolutely. Okay, it's your call. What you're doing is you're identifying paths in your network diagram that you need to pay attention to as a project manager. Because that is the key question that you need to ask every person that comes to you and says, I'm late on this particular deliverable, or we're going to have problems with this one because the resources aren't going to show up. Your first question should be, is it on the critical path? And maybe the second one is it on the near critical path? And if the answer to that is, I have no idea, then you haven't educated your folks very well. They need to know if they're working on something that's on the critical path. Now, here's the hard part about this. These paths change throughout the project. The critical path today, after, let's say, a week goes by, based on when things are finished or changed, the critical path could change. So I was working on the critical path all last week, but now I'm not. That's absolutely a true statement. It could happen. All right, within the critical path, there are several factors that you need to kind of understand. And I'm going to walk through these. First of all, before we dive into all this stuff here, on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a big giant node of representing a node diagram. That is, those elements are elements that you need to pay attention to, both on the exam and in real project management life. You need to have, in the middle of that activity, we've got the activity name. That could be whatever it is, install server. For the test, it's going to be probably a letter like A or B or whatever. At the top of the block, either outside the block or at the very top middle, you're going to have the activity duration. And at the bottom, you're going to have what's called float. We'll talk about float in a second. Upper left-hand corner is going to be the early start for the project. That is the earliest the project can start. And then you're going to calculate from that information and the duration what's the early finish. You're also going to be interested in what's the latest you can start. And using other information, you can also determine the latest you can finish. With those 6 pieces of information, 7 pieces of information, you can determine a lot of things about your project. Number one, the critical path, but the only thing you need for the critical path is the duration. The rest of them are going to help you manage float as well as just knowing where you are in the project, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. On the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to see those things we just talked about. Name, duration, early start, early finish, late start, and late finish. And you notice early start has an acronym ES, then you have EF, LS, and LF. There's a lot of 2-letter acronyms on the exam that you may see, and just be aware of what they are so that as you read them, you don't gloss over them and miss something. Now, I told you that we talk about float or slack. They're synonymous. First of all, if you see the word slack, it means float. If you see the word float, it means slack. I'd say 80%, 90% is now float for the exam. So there's 3 basic types of float that you need to be concerned with. There's actually like 10 of them, but there's 3 of them we're going to be concerned with. The first one is what's called free float. Now this one is probably, you might see reference to it, but probably not any questions on it. Free float is the amount of time you can delay one activity without delaying the very next activity or the successor. So it's basically, it's good to know how much time could I delay or wait or hold up on this activity without influencing the next thing on the path. That's free float. The one we're going to play with the most, and the one you're going to see probably 98% of the time, is total float. That is the amount of time that you can delay an activity without impacting the final project duration. So how much time can I delay or wait or give on an activity without delaying the final end date? And the third one you might see a reference to, but only in reference. It's called project float. And it's basically the amount of time that the whole project can be delayed without delaying some externally imposed date. Here's an example of that. Let's say you have a project and it's to, I don't know, install new hardware in all the admin buildings by the end of the year. So you have an externally imposed date of the end of 2019. But you look at your project plan and you realize that, you know, today is February 26th. I can get this done by, I don't know, April 15th. Okay, so everything from April 15th to the end of the year is project float. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it can be a good thing or a bad thing. It's a lot of people don't like that term because it sort of implies, you know, I got plenty of time to do it. And it could invoke something called Parkinson's law, which basically is work expands to the time of work allowed. So if I have till the end of the year, why am I doing this in April? Why not take the rest of the year? There's a lot of reasons for not doing that or doing that. You have to kind of make those judgments, but that's the concept of project float. Primarily, we're going to focus on total float. All right, so with that in mind, I'm going to move to this picture of a piece of a network diagram. So on the far left-hand side, we've got start, and we've got finish on the far right-hand side. In the middle, we have, what, 7 activities, A, C, E, H, G, and S. And yes, they are not in alphabetical order, and that's because they just represent random activities. I remember a person asking me, how come they're not in alphabetical order? Because they aren't. The way they're noted there is you've got activity A is 4 days long. Activity C is 3 days, and you can see the pattern all the way through. Now, here's the question. If you look at this diagram, and this is what you're going to have to do on the test, but you're probably not going to get a diagram. You're going to get a text or a paragraph explaining the relationship of these activities and have to draw your own picture and then answer this question. What's the critical path? So if you look at that diagram, what's the critical path? And it's going to start with start and end with finish and go through one or more sets of those activities. Anybody?
16 days.
Let's see, 7, 12, 16, 14 days. Did I add right? 7 and 5 is 12.
7 and 5 is
it'd be, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. It's 4 plus 7 is 11 plus 5 is 16. However, you have done what is the classic mistake on critical path, because I asked you what the critical path was, and what you answered was, what's the duration? The duration is actually 16 days. The critical path is start, A, G, S, finish. For the exam, they will try to trick you, just like I did there, and ask you what the critical path was, and one of the answers, answer A, will be 16 days. And you quickly add it up and go, oh, it's 16 days. But that wasn't the question. The question was, what's the critical path? Answer D is start, A, G, S, finish. So
Yeah.
be very careful. Are they asking you the path or the duration? Okay. Now, if you look at the other path, there's only one other path you can take on this project. You can go from A to C to E to H and finish. How many days long is that?
A couple days shorter.
Okay, 2 days shorter. Because these are in parallel and there's no overlapping or interaction between activities, one other thing you can tell without doing a lot of work, I also know what the float is for activities C, E, and H. It's going to be the differential between 16 days and 14 days. So if someone said, what's the float for activity C? I can tell you right now it's 2 days. What's the float for activity E? It's 2 days. What's the float for activity H? It's 2 days. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, 2 days, 2 days, 2 days, that's 6 days of float. Do you have 6 days of float? No, you only have 2 days of float to be shared on the entire path. Okay, we're going to drive this home. I promise. I know it's confusing right now, but kind of get that picture painted. So 16 days on the bottom path. And one other thing about the bottom path, if I asked you a question, what's the float on activity G? What would be the answer?
2 days.
Activity G. Is activity G on the critical path?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, so it's 0.
0. Activity A, float on activity A, 0. Float on activity S, 0. If it's on the critical path, it has 0 float. Now, what does that really mean? That means you got 7 days to do activity G, and if you take 8 days, you've now extended your project 1 day, unless you make it up on S. Okay? So here's where this comes into play. There's lots of definitions that go with this, and we've already talked about a couple of them. It's the longest path. It's the path which determines the shortest duration. It's the path with 0 float. We're talking critical path. It's the path in which delays to the schedule or problems are most likely. This is the one you pay attention to as a project manager, because all the other paths in the network have some built-in float. 2 days in the case of this diagram, but there could be you could have a float of a month on a project, on a activity. If you got a float of a month, then you can kind of move resources around or switch schedules or do a lot of things. You have to understand where the float is in order to make it work. Whoops. Then you can have more than one critical path. So in this particular diagram, we only have one critical path. What if we change activity E to 7 days? What does that do to our diagram? If we change activity E to 7 days, that makes the top part also 16 days, which makes all the activities critical. You don't want that as a project manager. You'd want to go back and work on your developed schedule and fix things. Well, are those the right estimates? Could we move this somewhere else? You don't want to have if you can, more than one critical path. Certainly if they're in the same general area. Now, if they're in total different areas done by total different groups, maybe there's not a big issue. But if they're tight together, you're making your life miserable. So you don't want to have that many critical paths. So as less you can, the better. Okay, and then we talked about a non-critical path. And I could classify that top path as non-critical, but it's up to you. All right, so question down at the bottom. What's the critical path? We already determined that. What's the duration? Determine that, 16 days. And the float for G is 0. The float for H is
2 days.
2 days. And what if C was changed to 8 days?
Good. Now you just changed the critical path.
Yeah, critical path is now the top path, which is A, C, E, H finish, and the bottom path now would inherit float. And you see how that can happen in a dime? I mean, you're just working along in a project and something changes because of whatever, your critical path can change.
Yep.
Which changes everything. And this is a moving target. So how often do you check the moving target? That depends on your plan for schedule management. I say no more than once a week, but it could be every 2 weeks because things will even out. I mean, if you want to micromanage, you can check it every hour if you want, but I do it about 2 weeks. Okay. So I'm going to run you through a series of questions here or problems and see how quickly we can get through these. Looking at the screen, what's the critical path?
11, 8. The start, see, end, finish.
Yeah, and you almost said 13, somebody did. The critical path is start, see, end, finish. And that's normally the way you'll see it on the exam. So if I asked you a question, what's the float on N, what would you say?
0.
0. What's the float on A?
2 days.
2 days.
2.
They're not parallel. And that's, if you can understand this concept, there's a lot of questions on the exam that you'll be able to answer in like 20 seconds versus doing a whole lot of work on it. Because we'll get to some of the calculations. I'm going to show you how to do it, but I'm going to hopefully teach you that you don't need to do it, that you're aware enough of the bigger picture to figure this out sort of on your own. All right, so there's the critical path. We just kind of went that, and the duration is 13 days. All right, so you might see a question on the exam, something like this. You'll get a little table, and that table is very representative of something you might see in Microsoft Project. You've got the activity, the start, and the different activities and the finish, and then you've got the duration in the second column, and then the predecessors in the third column. Now, is everybody good on what a predecessor is?
Yeah, something that has to be done. Well, not always has to be done, but something that comes before.
Something that comes before it. So when you look at this table, and I see activities start 0 days, and it doesn't have any predecessor, it's basically the first diagram block I'm going to draw.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one I'm going to draw is A, and I'm going to know that A has a duration of 8 days. And where does A go? It goes right after start. Everybody with me?
Yep.
Okay, so what I want you to do is use this table. I want you to draw your own diagram on a piece of paper, since you can't draw on my screen. And draw the diagram and answer 2 questions. What's the critical path and what's the duration? And I'm going to go ahead and just holler at me when you're done, and I'm going to tell you how much time you took. So go ahead and begin.
right, I think I got it.
245.
All right, I got it. Thank
256 or 252, I'm sorry.
Those are easy to do. That's a little easier than Sudoku.
Yeah, just there's a couple reasons I had to do it like this, but I'll explain it in a minute.
Okay, I think I do.
About 315, maybe 320. Now, those, as you were working this particular problem, you probably were thinking, well, I've gone over my 1 minute and 10 seconds. This is a good example of, yes, it might take more than a minute and 10 seconds, but a lot of times the problems like these on the exam, if you get one of these, unfortunately, they'll come with sister and brother problems. And it'll be something like answer the following network diagram and use this information for the next 3 questions.
Oh, so you get it wrong in the beginning, you get it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're screwed if you get it wrong, but you also already have a basis for maybe a couple more questions. So another guideline here is when you draw, first of all, you'll get 6 blank pieces of paper on the exam. So when you draw this diagram out, you want to draw it where you can read it, where it's reusable, and you don't want to throw it away because you may not get the question right after it. You may get one 20 later that's, hey, I wish I had that diagram again because it's the same one. So just know that that's going to happen. And also don't freak out if you're taking 3 minutes because you're going to make it up on other questions. Now, the good news is A, you probably will never get a question with 2 things on it like duration and critical path. It would just be 1. And the other news is it probably wouldn't have, 7 different activities. It would only have maybe 4. So they won't be as complex as this, even though this was fairly easy. So what did we get? What'd you get for the critical path?
It's the start AKRH finish, and that's a path of 20.
Okay.
20 days.
Norva, did you get that?
for critical path.
Yeah. You get that same thing?
No, it's the longest one, right? The
Right, the longest path.
Start AK R Q E.
I'm not sure if we have a QE in there. Maybe.
I don't know. Sorry. R. And then. Oh.
All right. Well, here's what it should have looked like. If you drew it out, you drew a block that looked like it looks something like this. And I realize this is in PowerPoint, and you didn't draw it in PowerPoint, but and I don't know why that big red arrow is there, but it is.
Yeah.
It's probably a PowerPoint glitch in a font thing. But A comes after start, K comes after A, R comes after K, and then you have Q down there also coming off of start, and E coming off of Q.
Mm-hmm.
H connects to both R and E, and then you finally finish. And it should look something like this. Now, your path, your AKRH finish, could have been on the bottom, depending on how you drew it, but it still would be a path of 20 days. So
Nailed it.
Your duration is 20. The path is start, AKRH, finish. Now, that's maybe worth a couple of questions, but the concept is more important. You probably won't have to draw a whole lot on the exam, but notice my blocks are pretty big. And then the reason they're big is because I want to leave enough room to, if I have to, put the other 4 pieces of data, the early start, early finish, late start, and late finish data in the block. If I had to use this diagram for a second question, I wouldn't want to have real tiny little blocks that I couldn't write anything in. Okay? So I'm just giving you some tips. All right, everybody.
I missed that start predecessor on Q. That's why.
Yeah, E was the predecessor. So and you could have skipped down and first put A down there, and then you could have skipped down and put Q and started your drawing that way, and then gone back and forth. But I like to just go in order. Now, if you go in order, sometimes you can't draw an activity until you skip one and kind of have it fill in the blanks. So it's not always one after the other, but you won't have one that complicated. All right, so I'm going to give you a realistic problem on the exam, and I want you. This one's what you'll probably get. So try this one, and let's see what we get.
Okay.
Finished.
Okay.
I think.
Less than a minute. I didn't officially time you, but it should have been a little quicker than the other one. But
Yeah, I'm finished as well.
it kind of depends on the reading, and it kind of depends on, you know, deciphering and those kind of things.
Yes, I
Got it? Okay.
These are fun.
These are what you'll probably get one of these on the exam. Okay. And it may not, you know, be as straightforward as this, and it may be even simpler than this. A lot of times they test you on just between, they'll just describe two activities and kind of give you a picture between two and ask you questions about them. But if you understand these concepts, you'll do very well on this. So what was your diagram? It should have been what is it, 5 activities?
5 activities total.
I did.
And it should have looked something like that.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
with the exception of these little blocks in the corner, which those would not be there because you just wouldn't draw them in yet. But the reason I'm showing them is so to demonstrate what I just said a minute ago. Let's say your question, instead of being to determine the duration of the critical path, was what's the late start for activity, I don't know, activity B. Then you've got a space in order to put that in order to calculate it. And if you follow these next steps we're about to do, you'll understand what that is, because we're going to use the zero start method. So there's some value in leaving some spaces there. If the next question asked that and you had real tiny little blocks, you wouldn't be able to draw it, and you go, crap, I got to draw this again. So just leave space. You don't have to draw the blocks. So the critical path is start, B, D, finish. And the duration is 17 days. And that also, can you tell what the float is on activity A, C, or E?
Sure.
Yeah. It's 13. It's the difference in your 17 minus 13. So it's going to be 4.
Mm-hmm.
4 days. Yep.
And it's going to be 4. Let's say instead of just 3 activities, you had 20 activities. Would you need to calculate it? No, it's going to be 4 for all of them if they're all on that same path. Now, if they share paths, and there's some complications, but in this particular diagram, let's say the number wasn't 8, it was, I don't know, 382. And so you're dealing with a calculator. You have to calculate the float. And you calculate the bottom path instead of 17 days is 1,692 days. So you have to do the math, and you calculate the difference between those two, and you come out with, I don't know, 862. You don't have to do C and E because they're going to be the same. No matter what, as long as they're in that same pattern. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's the basis of critical path. Now, in order to do what we're about to do, you need to understand that there are 4 other components that we're going to play with in order to do forward and backward pass. And there's our big picture of that schedule node diagram. And I'll tell you a little story about why I put this up. First of all, when I did my test and I made my little brain dump, I wrote this little diagram down. I drew it on a corner of a note because I don't know why, but when somebody says, oh, what's the late finish or what's the early start? For the life of me, I can't remember which corner these four go in. So I always just drew it out. And once I started writing it out, early start, early finish, late start, late finish, I just knew where they were. But I do it every time. I'm not saying you have to do that, but I'm just telling you that that's why the block is here. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill in these pieces of data, the early start, the early finish, the late start, late finish. And what's that going to do is give us the ability to calculate our float. And so what we're going to do is something called the forward and backward pass. I'm going to teach you how to do that, but I'm going to also teach you all the shortcuts. So we're going to kind of do the shortcuts as well, and hopefully you can apply those when you do the real exam and feel really confident about the 1 or 2 questions you're going to get on this. All right, so to calculate total float, there are some formulas that go with that. There's 2 of them, but they're the same formula. The formula for float is late start minus early start, or late finish minus early finish. So that's basically the bottom left-hand side minus the top right, or the bottom right-hand side minus the top right. So in this particular case, it's either 10 minus 7 or 18 minus 15. That's what the formula is. Now, you can remember the formula all day long, but I like to draw the little block and just know it's the bottom number and subtract the top number from it. So based on what I just told you, what's the float for that activity?
3.
3. It's 10 minus 7 or 18 minus 15. Now, do you need to do both sides? No. If you do one side, the other side's going to be the same.
They are always going to be the same?
Are going to be the same, yes. Now, if, and there's the math behind that, 10 minus 7, 18, both sides are going to equal the same float. So you're going to be dealing with small numbers on the exam, mostly, like these. But if in case of a real problem, and that wasn't 7, it was, 18,662, yeah, and you did the math on one side, it would be the same as if you did it on the other side. Be different numbers, but the result would be the same. Okay, now, just to show you how this works, if this activity A was a critical path activity, how much float would it have? 0. If in fact it's on the critical path and you know what the early start is, which is 7 in this case, then you also know what the late start is. It's the same. The bottom and top numbers are going to match if it's on the critical path. So if you know the top and bottom, if you know the 7 and the 15, you don't even need to worry about the bottom because they're going to be 7 and 15. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That's the only way you can get 0 is float, because 15 minus 15 is 0 and 7 minus 7 is 0. Now these are things that'll help you shortcut-wise, because you won't have to do a lot of the math that we're about to do. But I'm going to show you how to do it anyway. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the 0 start method. There is another method, but I'm going to teach you the 0 start. This is how you would do a forward and backward pass to calculate float. Now, on the exam, you can do this if you want. You may get a diagram like this. This is one of the rare cases where they actually have to have a diagram. And you can do all what we're about to do, or you can do the shortcut. I'm going to teach you the shortcut first. The shortcut would be, I'm just going to look at this diagram and see what's my question. Okay, so with no data entered, we haven't done anything yet. Can you tell me what the critical path is?
Start A, B, finish, assuming that
Start
assuming
A,
that's 28 of the days, yeah.
Yeah, those are days. Okay, so, and they're just outside the block, and that's a good example. Sometimes they're inside, sometimes they're outside. So what if the question, you had this diagram and the question was, what's the critical path? Well, most people are going to sit there and do this forward and backward pass, which we're about to do, and they're going to come up with the same answer. And if you know what the concept is, and you can just say that's the critical path is start A, B, finish. Now, what if the question was, what's the duration?
12.
12. Okay, what if they said, what's the float for A?
0.
0. What if they said, what's the float for G?
4.
4. Guess what? You now have all the data we're about to do with this little convoluted problem I'm going to show you, but I want to show you how to do it anyway so you know real life. This is all done in an automated fashion in Microsoft Project, but here's how it works. We're going to start at day 0. Now, this is somewhat controversial, but that's the way I teach it now. It's less math. Some people have heartburn because 0 is not really a day, but pretend like it's a stopwatch or a starter's pistol. Okay, so all this is a mark in time. We're going to start our project, bang, start. It's going to take, the duration of this project is 4 days. So we're going to take our 0, which is our early start. That's why I have my little diagram up in the upper right-hand corner, because my brain doesn't work very well on this. Early start plus 4, which is the duration, equals our early finish. And then we're going to take our 4, which is our early finish, and carry it forward, and it's going to become early start for B. And then we're going to take 4 plus 8 is 12. Well, isn't that what we just got? 12. Now we're going to do the same thing for the bottom. We're going to start at 0 because it starts right after start. 0 plus 1 is 1. We're going to carry the 1 forward. 1 plus 7 is 8. We now have the 12 and 8 that we already had. Now we're going to do the complicated part, at least it is for some people. We're going to figure out the backward pass. So what we want to do, and can you guys see my mouse?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What we're going to try to do is figure what this block is right here. And this is probably one of the more critical ones that you can figure out, because once you figure this out, it'll tell you a lot of data. So if our earliest that we're going to finish this project, or our biggest number is 12, what's the latest we can finish it? If our early finish is 12, which is this one right here, the latest we're going to be able to finish it is 12.
Oh, yeah, same day. Mm-hmm.
It's got to be the same day. So what's going to happen is 12 days is going to go in there. And there's another reason you know that. Because you know already from your brain power.
Those numbers are all going to match.
Right. That's exactly where I was going. You know that's the critical path, and you know that it has 0 float, so you know those are all going to match. There's where I'm going. So do we need to even do the math going backwards? No, we know that 4 is going to be the next number that goes there, and we know that 4 is going to go there, and 0 is going to go there. But if we want to do the math, it's 12 minus 8 is 4. Carry the 4 backwards. 4 minus 4 is 0. With me?
Yep.
All right, now, so that's the easy part because that's on the critical path. Here's the one that's very important to get right. So if this is the longest duration we can do on this project, we can't go over 12 days because that's our critical path. Whatever this number is, this 12 here for your late finish, it is also going to be the late finish for every other path in your network.
Mm-hmm.
So guess what number goes here?
12.
12, yeah. And now you can't just match the numbers because we have some float. So you would have to do the math. 12 minus 7 is 5.
Mm-hmm.
Carry the 5 backwards. 5 minus 1 is 4. Now you've completed the forward and backward pass, and now you're going to calculate the float. So to calculate the float, you would, in the A there, I'm hoping this is A. In A, I'm going to take 0 minus 0 or 4 minus 4, which is 0. I'll agree? Now, did I know that already? Yes, because it's a critical path. Now, if the float is 0 here, it's automatically 0 here, but we already knew that because it's on the critical path. And 12 minus 12 and 4 minus 4 is 0. Okay, now, down here, what's the float? We said it earlier when we did it before we had any numbers in here, it was going to be 4. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's 4 because you take 12 minus 8 or 5 minus 1. And there's your forward and backward pass. So could you have gotten the answers to most of those questions or most of that data without doing a single piece of that? Yes, if you have an understanding of this method. That's what I'm trying to get to. Okay? So let's do one here. I'm going to walk through this and see if we can do this. I'll ask you each to give me the early start and early finish. And Dave will give me for A, then Norvin for B, and Tatiana for C, and then back to Dave, and we'll walk through this. Now, before we do that, we're going to do just what we did before. With no data entered, what's the critical path? What's the duration? What's the float? And I'm going to ask you, what's the float for the float and LS for activity G? Can you tell me all those pieces of information?
Start, A, B, C, finish is the critical path.
Okay. Dave, you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. That's 16. So I'm already calculating for G.
16 days. Okay. And the bottom path is 7 days. So we know what the float is, right?
What is that? 4?
9.
9, sorry.
16 minus 7 be 9. So we know the float's 9. So that answers our critical path, our duration, and our float. What did I ask there? What's the late start for activity G? So we're looking for that bottom left-hand block for activity G. Can you get that one too?
11.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. See, you already know how to do this, or at least the math behind it before we've done it. Tatiana, are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what we're going to do is walk through this. So Dave, give me the first one. What do we got? What's our first two variables? Early start, early finish for A.
That's going to be 0 for early start and 4 for early finish.
Okay. And Norvin? B?
4 for early start and 12.
Okay. And then we move forward. Tatiana, C?
12 and 16.
Yeah. And that's the top half. That's the forward pass on the top half. So the bottom half, Dave again?
0 on float, so just carry the numbers down.
Wait a minute. We're doing the second path. We're still doing.
Oh, I see. Down there in D. 0 and 2.
0 and 2, and then Norvin. G.
2 and then 7.
7. Okay, so now we've completed the forward pass. So the backward pass would be, we start with C up there. Tatiana, what do we got for late finish for C?
16.
16.
12.
And we know that because it's the latest that the project can finish. We also know that because that's the critical path and they have to match. So going backwards, it's 16 and 12. And then Dave?
4 to 0.
Well, okay, Tatiana, finish it out. What do we got for the top line?
12.
12
4.
and 4,
4, 0.
and then 4 and 0. Okay, so and those are going to be like that every time. So the bottom one is the critical one. Norvin, what's the late finish for G?
16.
16. And once you put 16 in there, now you can do the backwards part. And we already discussed that the late start was going to be 11. So the only way it's going to be, it's going to be 11 because it's 16 minus 5.
5.
Okay, so now what do we got for D, Dave?
11 underneath the 2.
Yeah,
And then a 9.
a 9. And now you've completed the forward backward pass, and we now know all the numbers that we already knew when we did it with no data in it. Now we can calculate the float. The float's going to be 0, 0, and 0 because that's critical path. And the float for the bottom ones is going to be 9 and 9. Clear?
Mm-hmm.
And all this is, people ask me, why are we doing this manually? And because
Yeah, why are we?
I know, they see, there you go. Because it's on the exam this way, it's sort of understand how it's done. Yeah, this is all done by a computer. And if you put it in a Microsoft project and you keep up with this data of when things were finished and all this, you can keep running this and have your own diagram of this. But just, this is PMPs that kind of, understand the math. I don't know any other way to explain it other than they've had it since 1987 and they probably aren't going to change it. All right, I'm going to make it.
In the exam, quick question. In the exam, you have to show
the forward and backward pass, or can you just answer like whatever their question is?
No,
Like they have
just
like
answer
what?
Just answer the question. There's A, B, C, and D. You'll never have to show your work.
Oh, got it. Okay.
You will.
It's always multiple choice, right, Bill?
All of them are multiple choice. Now,
Yeah.
if let's say you draw this diagram out on your blank pieces of paper, you don't get to keep those papers when you leave the exam. They take all that stuff back from you. So yes, you can write it all down and have it written, but you don't need it. It's not part of the exam. The exam is A, B, C, or D. Or it could be B, C, D, E, whatever I had on that one.
Yeah.
Sorry. All right. To finish this up, notes about the critical path. We already talked about this first one. There can be more than one. Having several of them can create high risk, and that certainly the critical path can change over time. Any one of these events can happen and cause the critical path to change, and you need to be aware of that. There can be what's called negative float. Negative float is when that end date is less than the date you have to finish. Let's say you have a 20-day project. You planned it out. You have a beautiful network diagram. You worked your butt off, and 20 days is what it's going to finish. And your boss comes up and says, yeah, that's real great, but you got to finish it in 15 days. Well, you now have a negative float of 5 days. You got to make that up somehow. How would you make up a float of 5 days?
You can either change the scope or
Do that.
or apply more resources.
Yep, you can do that. And that's crashing. You could overlap task, which is fast tracking, which we'll talk about in a minute. You could, let's say you haven't even started the project yet. What could you do to make up your days? And it's sort of an odd way to make them up, but it works. I haven't started yet.
Eliminate.
Well, you could eliminate something, but the easy way is just start 5 days earlier.
Okay.
Okay, start it 5 days earlier. You're really taking 20 days, but you finish it within that 15-day deadline. And we're talking calendar, opportunity, and all that. I'm just trying to point out there can be negative floats. If somebody says, oh, there's negative float, they didn't make that up. There can be. It's something you don't want, but it can happen. Okay, if there's negative float, you basically could compress the schedule, and that is basically adding more resources. You could cut the activity duration or the critical path or start the thing earlier. We already talked about those. All right, I'm going to go into this some of the tools that you have to use. These tools that we're about to talk about, these same tools are applicable to the last step, which is control the schedule. So we're going to talk about them once, and then on control schedule, they're the same tools. First one is schedule compression. So what are you doing in schedule compression is basically you're trying to compress the schedule without changing the scope. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, you have a couple options. One, you can fast track. Now, fast tracking is synonymous with doing things in parallel. Another way to think of fast tracking in today's vernacular is multitasking. I'm going to do A and B at the same time. Now, can you do two things at the same time?
I mean,
It's
a simple
possible.
resource can't, but
Yeah, in real life, we probably can. I mean, multitasking in its truest sense is not possible. If you think of a computer, we're not really doing things at the same time. We're just doing them so fast you can't tell. If they're far enough apart, you could probably get away with it. But if you're doing two things that are sharing resources and have the same kind of results or same sharing results, it just becomes a catastrophe. So you got to be very careful. When you do fast tracking, you increase risk. Remember I told you want to set your project up in serial. You want to do A, then B, then C, or whatever letters they are, and don't start one until the other one's finished. Fast tracking is I'm going to do A and B and start them at the same time. And oh, by the way, let's start C early and D at the same time, and we'll start E, F, and G at the same time as D, and we'll just finish so much earlier. But you're now doing so many things at once. It's like, well, which aircraft do we bring into land? Well, let's bring all of them in at the same time and see who gets there first. Probably not a great example, but you get the idea. Once you start doing that, you require a lot more attention, a lot more communications, etc. Fast tracking is a decent option, but it adds more risk. So here's a picture. We got activity 1, 2, and 3, and then to fast track it would be on the other side of the red arrow. We're going to do activity 1, but we're going to start 2 and 3 at the same time. Okay? Fast tracking, a method of schedule compression, one of the two. The second one is crashing. Crashing is basically where you add more resources. It's basically a game of cost and schedule trade-offs in how to compress the schedule. It's mostly associated with putting extra resources into one activity. Now, I'm going to tell you too that there's some methods you may not have thought of. Overtime is technically crashing.
Yeah.
Somebody working on the weekend where you're not, if they're salaried employee and they're not getting paid, that's sort of crashing. Yeah, they might do it on their own. They might do it for a while. That example I gave earlier about gold plating. The programmer who loves to do this stuff, you think, well, that doesn't cost me any extra money. They're doing it on their own time. But over time, it does. It costs morale. I mean, there's some expectations eventually. So that's another way of crashing. Typically, crashing is, well, I got 4 resources. Let me add 2 more. And typically, this is the response for most bosses. Oh, you're having problems on your project. Let me give you some more people. They're never the right people. They're just people. And if they're not trained, you could be, into that law of diminishing returns where it's a worst case scenario rather than helping you. So if you're behind schedule, you can follow these steps to do crash. You want to check your risk and re-estimate. And then you can either fast track the project or crash the project. Now, I don't think there's an example of crashing in here, but on the exam and in my document that I sent you, which, by the way, Tatiana, you need to send me an email so I've got your email so I can send you this stuff.
Send you email again.
Yeah, just send me an email to my Gmail address, to that project management address that you have, or
I don't know.
I'll see if I can. I'll get one and look one up. So anyway, if you're behind schedule, these are the 3 steps. But where I was going with this is on crashing the project. There is possibly some math to this where you're trying to figure out which project or which activity you would crash. And I'm going to give you a couple of rules. Number 1, you always crash where you can get the option you need, or the days or months or weeks you need for the lowest cost. And number 2, you always crash earlier than later. So if you have an opportunity to crash something and it's kind of early in your project, but you could also crash it later in your project, crash it earlier. That gives you opportunity to recover. And I'll take that back. There's 3 things. The third one is you only crash if it's on the critical path. And why would you not crash something that's not on the critical path?
Because you've got float time to accommodate.
Absolutely. You've got float. Now that float may be 1 day or 2 days, and there are instances where you can crash non-critical path things, but for the exam, just remember, don't crash unless it's on the critical path based on the float scenario. Okay? There's your 4th option, reduce scope. I hate doing that because people do not like to hear that their particular part of the project was cut or moved on to another place.
Or pushed into the next sprint.
Yeah, and then the last one on there, just so I'm not leaving it out, is cut quality, which you can probably get away with that, but it's risky. And cutting quality doesn't mean you're just taking shortcuts necessarily, but it might mean instead of 3 weeks of testing, you're only doing 2. So there's
Tell Samsung that on their batteries on that cut quality.
There you go. Yeah.
All right. So one other tool you can consider, actually there's a couple more, is called a what-if scenario analysis. And basically it's pretty simple. It's what if X changes, would it produce a shorter schedule? What if we got 3 resources and could do this in 2 days rather than 5 days? What if we started this on the weekend where we didn't have any traffic and everybody could get in earlier? What if, and you can go on and on and on with that. And so when you look at your schedule and realize that it's too hard to do or too uncomfortable to commit to, then you're going to go through some of these what if analysis. Now, if you see a question on what if analysis on the exam, based on assumptions changing or whatever the reason is, the tool you want to think of is the Monte Carlo analysis. It is an official tool that's available out there. There are many Excel add-ons that simulate a full Monte Carlo analysis. And I'm going to give you a short version of what a Monte Carlo analysis is. It's basically a tool that analyzes your data that you collected from your PERT numbers. So you have to have estimated with pessimistic, most likely, and optimistic. It takes all of those values for your thousands of activities, and you have to enter them into a computer, so you got a lot of data entry to do. And it runs a regression analysis that basically will tell you the likelihood of your project being finished in whatever estimated time that you had. And it runs the scenario thousands of times and gives many different options. So it's a pretty reliable tool for prediction of completion or prediction of schedule. It's also expensive. Expensive both in the computer software and the time, etc. But it's a great tool if you use 3-point estimates. Let's see. Simulation tells you the probability of completing the project on a specific day, completing it for a specific cost, probability of any activity actually being on the critical path, overall risk of the project. It's a pretty darn good tool. Monte Carlo can converge. The one thing it does differently than PDM is it can converge multiple paths and kind of make it truly how it could happen in a real project. I'm going to classify it as much more pessimistic than PERT. For example, if you did a PERT estimate and you said it's going to take between 10 and 12 days, the Monte Carlo analysis would probably say it's more likely between 12 and 15.
Mm-hmm.
And that's rough. I mean, I didn't do any math to prove that. I just so you know that. And what that always taught me is that if I come up with a PERT estimate, I'm still thinking that's only probably 80% chance of happening, not 100. Monte Carlo is going to be closer to the 100. All right, couple other tools you may consider when you're doing all this developing your schedule. One of them is called resource leveling. Now, resource leveling is basically the art of making sure nobody's underutilized, and I guess in fairness, nobody's overutilized. And more so, it's looked at as overallocated. So if we look at this diagram, we see, let's look at that blue block down there as indicating, say, I don't know, maybe it's a 40-hour week or 40 hours. And that red area up there, whoever's that person or that group is overallocated. So if you've got somebody that's overallocated, you want to rebalance that. Now, if you take all of those hours and move them into your normal 40-hour week, what does that do to the schedule? Does that extend it?
Yeah, but yes.
Yeah, it's going to extend it. It's going to make it longer because I was counting on Dave working, he's supposed to be working 16 hours a day for the next week.
Right.
Whoops. I got to reallocate Dave because he's going to be really pissed if he has to work 16 hours. So I'm going to take all those hours and stretch it out to the second week. Well, that changes the schedule. So yeah, it can be done, but it does increase the schedule. So basically what you need to remember about resource leveling is just looking at over allocated stuff. And that happens when you put together a whole bunch of resources and you're not paying attention. You realize at the end of the game, you got some poor engineer working 90 hours a week. There's not that many hours anyway. There's only 68, and you wouldn't want them to work that many anyway. So you can use resource leveling. Used to produce it's used to produce a limited resource schedule, especially if you're resource constrained, which most people are. kind of allows you to see the peaks and valleys in your resource usage and use to keep the levels constant. Doesn't show underutilized. Underutilized is a hard one to do because a lot of people aren't fully tasked to your project. They're only tasked at 20% or 10% or whatever percent. Okay, this is kind of a picture of resource leveling, and actually this is right out of the PMBOK. You see the top half, you've got activity A and B, and Sue is allocated for both activities, so she's allocated for 16 hours. And if you do the resource leveling, that's going to change the scope of this project a little bit. So instead of it taking 2 days on your real schedule, which was having poor Sue work on 2 things, now you've got it done in 3 days and everybody's fairly allocated. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You won't have to do any drawings, you won't have to do any calculations, you just have to basically kind of understand that's a tool that you can use to help develop your schedule. Now, the other half of this, or the other optimization tool, is called smoothing. I love the name. Smoothing is basically making sure that resources don't exceed any kind of predefined limits. You use the critical path for smoothing, and you're making sure that you're only using the right number of assets. You can specifically move assets around based on your float. So if you have float for a project, let's say you have 2 days of float and you have a couple of resources assigned to that activity, you could move those resources to another activity and cause that and kind of use up that float. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so what you're doing is you're moving around your resources to make use of less resources but not affect your critical path. The critical path doesn't change. Unlike leveling, where you're going to extend the project, here you're just moving resources around based on float in order to get the biggest bang for the buck but not change your critical path. So here's my quick example of smoothing. Hopefully you can see this. You got start, A, B, and C as your 3 activities, and finish. You can see the duration, 2 days, 5 days, and 3 days. The resources required are in red up there on the upper left. You got 2 resources for A and 4 for B and 2 for C. So your original plan says I'm going to use 8 resources. Is there any way to do this with less resources? That's kind of what smoothing is. And if this is your diagram based on what we just did, what's the critical path and the float? We already showed you the float.
The B path.
Yeah, start, B, and finish. That's your longest path. That's 5 days. The other two paths, one of them's 2 days and the other's 3 days. One of them has a float of 3 and the other has a float of 2. So what that tells you is that you can play around with A or C in moving your resources around. So if you were to originally schedule this in considering smoothing, it might look like this diagram down here on the bottom. And if you look at that, we're going to start A, B, and C at the same time. We're going to utilize our 8 resources. You can see 2 for C, 4 for B, 2 more for A, which is 8 resources. And you can see the progression of A, B, and C, and it goes all the way out to 5 days. We finish C in 3 days, and we finish A in 2 days. Okay. Now, what if somebody said, "Oh, you only have 6 resources to do this with. We're taking 2 of your resources and we're going to move them somewhere else."
You got to knock that A block.
Yeah, you could change either you could wait and do the A block later, or you could manipulate the C block. And here's an example of what it might look like. So here I'm gonna delay C until after A.
Yeah.
Now there's some issues here. Number one, we're making an assumption that the same 2 resources that do A are doing C. And if activity A was, a graphical design problem and C was a painting problem, we may not be able to do this. But you can see now, did we change the duration? Nope. 5 days. Did we use less resources? Yep. And that's what smoothing is. Clear?
Yeah.
All right. So you've got lots of tools. You've got fast tracking. You've got crashing. You've got what-if analysis or Monte Carlo. You've got smoothing. You've got leveling. All of these are at your disposal to finalize your schedule. You're still in planning. You're trying to produce a schedule that's A, believable, B, realistic, C, you're going to get graded on, hopefully promoted, and all this other stuff. So you don't want to throw something out there that's a piece of junk. So that's why you have all these tools. All right. We're going to talk about critical chain. It's not in the PMBOK anymore. It used to be, but at least I'm going to give you a quick introduction to it. Critical chain is another method that sometimes is used when resources are kind of a tight issue. Basically, you create a network diagram just like you did in the other activities, and you're trying to figure out a schedule that allows you to assign each activity as late as possible in the project but still meet the end date. Now that sounds kind of convoluted, and I'll paint a picture for you of how it works in a minute. Resource dependencies are basically added to the critical chain, and then you're kind of calculating when you're going to finish. And then when you finish with that part of it, you basically add buffers on, which is sort of like padding. So you're going to add some time onto the project. The premise of critical path, and this is a very simplistic view, is that you take your project, you cut it in half, you add half of what you cut off as your buffer, and you basically made your project 75% of what it was. And I'll demonstrate that in just a second. So plan, estimate, cut to half the time, and then add a quarter buffer. A couple of rules about critical chain that are kind of critical to the whole concept. You cannot allow multitasking. You need to have dedicated resources. This fits well with an agile project. Now, what does no multitasking mean? It means that your person that's working on your project, they're working on your project. They're not working on 2 other projects. Now, that's a hard thing to do, but that's kind of the rules. Okay? No dedicated, or you have no it needs dedicated resources, which is a scheduling and a personnel kind of issue. Now, here's how it works, or here's how it would look. Say this is your typical project. You have a 20-day project, and you have 4 activities. And there they are. They're not labeled, but look at those as 4 activities. And they're each 5 days long. Now, what I've shown here is how we typically do projects. The green block there, let's take that first block. That green section is my resource coming to work and doing a full day's work. Then on the next day, he only does half a day work. And the third day, he works overtime. That's the only way I can explain that fat line. And then he realizes he's not going to take 5 days to do this. So that 4th day, he goes and works on another project. And then he comes back and he finishes it up on the 5th day. So did he work 5 days on that activity? No, he only worked maybe 3.5. And then you can see the same pattern for the next 4 activities. That's how we work. So what are we doing in that white time when we're not spending time on activities? Well, we're doing other activities because we're multitasking. So we're truly losing time. So critical path assumes when you do the critical path method, which is what we just finished, you're assuming unlimited resources, you're allowing multitasking, and you're managing to your float. So that's your typical problem. And what we're doing now, we're going to, and that is a good example of what I explained before of Parkinson's law. I've basically set this out at 20 days. How many hours did we really put into it, or days? I don't know exactly, but those green look like roughly 12.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and that's realistic. That's how we do a project. So what's critical chain? Well, critical chain basically forces you to look at kind of if you have limited resources, and it basically changes the complexity of the project. We're not going to allow multitasking. We're going to finish this puppy as soon as we can, and we're going to manage to a buffer instead of a float. We're not going to have a float on each item. We're going to have this pocket of time at the end. So you take your 20-day project, you cut it in half, which is 10. That's the 2 white blocks there, 5 days each, and you add half of that on as a buffer, 5 more days, half of the 10 you cut off. Make sense?
Yep.
Now I got full dedicated resources. So here's what we look like after our first day. We put our people to work, and our first day, our 5-day activity got completed in 4 days. So we have an extra day. So what do we do with that extra day? We add it onto our buffer. Our buffer is now 6 days. We got 6 days of leeway. Okay. Now we move on to the next activity or the next 5 days. And in that particular one takes 6 days. So we just used up one of our buffer days. So what did we end up with here? We ended up only taking 11 days, or 10 actually, and we still had all our buffer left. So we essentially cut our project in half. I know this is, dreamland here. It doesn't always happen exactly like that, but that's the idea behind critical path. I'm sorry, critical chain. Okay. And there's a lot of YouTube videos out there if you want to get more information on it. I wouldn't spend that much time on it. I would know that it exists as a possible way to manage resources. I like this method, but it depends on no multitasking and dedicated resources. I have very few times I've ever gotten that.
In consulting, we do have dedicated resources, or at least
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. But you're not necessarily, and that's a good example. You are dedicated to doing what it is. So this is something you might consider. There's a couple good videos out there that, critical chain in 10 minutes or whatever. I've got one somewhere in my repertoire that explains it and does a great job at it. And there's probably numbers of books on it. This is originated by a guy named Goldratt. Elijah J. Goldratt came up with this. So if you want to consider it, you can. It did not make the new edition of the PMBOK. What does that mean? I don't know. I haven't seen it as feedback on anything in the last 6 months. So for what it's worth, that's critical chain. All right. I talked a little bit about Agile just at a high level. In Agile, you do something called release planning, which basically you're looking at when you're going to finish each action, and you develop a high-level summary of when you're going to finish your sprints. And it's on a 3 to 6 month schedule. It determines the number of iterations and sprints you're going to have. Now, if you don't understand that, an iteration is kind of it could be a part of a sprint or multiple sprints, but a sprint is a short period of work, usually 2 to 4 weeks, in which you produce a deliverable. So unlike a 1-year project where the deliverable isn't done until the end of the year, your deliverables in an Agile world are delivered every sprint. And that gives the customer a chance to look at it and go, nope, that's a piece of crap, change it. Or, oh, I love it, keep going. Hopefully it's the latter. Here's a kind of a picture of the Agile process. Okay. First of all, do either of you do, any of you do Agile? Tatiana or Dave, you said you had some Agile work. Don't you do Agile?
Yeah, I did a lot of it at the library when we would launch new software platforms for patrons.
So you're familiar with this. How about you, Norvin?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to give you my 2-minute, 3-minute pitch on Agile. Agile basically has a bunch of rules and processes. It is project management at a different level. It focuses on limited documentation, but that does not mean no documentation. There's still documentation. There's different rules. You start out with, up on the upper left there, your input from your end users, your customer, and your stakeholders. And they talk to somebody called a product owner. The product owner is a one-stop shop person that represents all of your stakeholders, all of your key stakeholders. That product owner is basically responsible for putting together basically a list of things to do called a product backlog. So let's say you have 100 things to do. And your team of 4 or 5 dedicated resources basically takes that product list and they turn it into their own list of a few things to do in a sprint. And a sprint is 1 to 4 weeks. So they take this list and turn it into a sprint backlog. That's the little red clipboard. And they do that in the 1 to 4 weeks. And they present that to the client. And they repeat that process over and over. Now, every day in the Agile process, you have something called a daily stand-up meeting where the dedicated team gets together and talks about, what did we do yesterday? What are we going to do today? And do I need any help? And where does the help come from? It comes from that little green guy up at the top called the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master is in lieu of a project manager, but does not have the exact same functions. Scrum Master basically is a I can help you. I can break down barriers. I can go talk to the product owner kind of person. They monitor things. They keep going on, keep it going on. They're kind of a glorified coordinator.
Yeah, or an engineer manager.
Could be. Other things that you do besides the daily meeting is at the end of each sprint, you have a review. How did we do? What do we need to do better? And then you can do a retrospective of kind of, you know, the big picture. And all of these are done in a routine basis, and you constantly do this. Now, a sprint could be, you could have 3 sprints, 6 sprints, 10 sprints, a whole bunch of sprints in order to get this backlog done. If there are any changes to the backlog, let's say you had 100 items on it, and after the first sprint, we wanted to kind of go and do, instead of doing items 20 through 25, we're now going to do items 50 through 100. You can change the order, you can reverse things. It's kind of a very fluid, moving target. And going back to our methodology, it was one of those methodologies, Agile, which is very iterative and change-driven. So here's the overview of the sprint meeting. Those are the 3 questions that are usually asked. And you do this every day. And the only people that get to talk are the people on the dedicated team. Any strap hangers or extra people can attend, but they cannot participate. They can just listen. And there's actually names for them. They call them chickens and pigs. That's a whole different story. The review meeting, there's kind of how did we do? And then the retrospective, more about future. What should we start doing? What should we stop doing? What should we continue doing? Did I summarize it pretty well there, Dave?
Yeah, and it's highly tailorable.
Yeah, that's a good definition for it. Agile is tailorable. It probably was designed and developed more for software projects, but the Agile world will tell you it applies to a lot more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now there's a picture of Agile release planning, and this term may come up on the exam, and you see different releases and different iterations. I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on this. Just if you understand Agile in general, like that last slide, you'll be good to go. All right, develop schedule. The project schedule is basically the result of all that work we just did. And it basically is shown many different ways. You can show it with or without dependencies, and it can be represented in many different formats. Your complete network diagram, which could be very detailed. You can represent it in simply milestone charts, which could be very high level, and you could represent it with bar charts or Gantt charts. Now, there is a difference. A pure bar chart does not have any dependencies, and a Gantt chart may have some dependencies. Now, here's what you need to know. Well, I'll show you examples of each one of these. There's a milestone chart. Pretty broad. Requirements gathered, design complete, coding complete, testing complete, implementation complete. Those are basically phases. Okay, that's a milestone chart. Now, the key about a milestone chart, if you're briefing a higher level person in your company, and I'll let you define that, you would use a milestone chart. You don't want to brief them with a network diagram. I mean, yeah, they might demand it, but this is the tool of choice. If you want to, you can use other things, but this is what PMI says. They're similar to bar charts, but they only show the major events. Okay, here's an example of a bar chart or a Gantt chart, and you basically have the days, the durations, and kind of a line there. I like to see bars, actual bars and durations, but this is an example. It says it's a week planning tool, and it's basically effective for progress control and reporting. It doesn't help you plan, it just shows what you've done. And then the last one, which we didn't show, is a full network diagram. I don't think that's on here. So there's when to use them. There's a summary of when to use them. I hope I got that. If you want to show dependencies and interdependencies, you're going to have a full network diagram. If you want to just report to senior management, milestone chart. If you want to track progress, Gantt chart or bar chart. Same thing. At least they call them the same. Questions? Okay, we got about 4 slides to go for this section. All right, develop the schedule. The output of this is going to be the schedule baseline. It's an approved version of the schedule. It's the line in the sand you agreed to be held accounted to whatever time frame you said you were going to meet this project in. Approved version. Use as the basis for comparison when you're done. You know, we said a year and it finished in a year. This is another diagram which is very similar to the one we saw before. We got our billing system, the invoice screen, our timeline, and basically the blue line on the bottom kind of shows, you know, or tracks our progress. I think that was all that was on that slide. Now, I told you that when we get to control schedule, that all the stuff we already talked about is pretty much the same from develop schedule to control schedule. It's the process now of monitoring all that stuff you put together. Monitoring, did you do every activity on time? Did everything work out the way you planned it to? What about changes you put in your project? Did that affect your schedule? So you're basically going to redo fast tracking, leveling, leads, lags, dependencies, all the stuff we've done already. You get to do it again if you're not on target. Project managers must measure against the plan. Basically, you're measuring planned against actuals, things that are causing the changes and must be influenced. And so here's the activities basically might be to re-estimate, conduct performance reviews, adjust for future delays, or measure against your schedule, measure variances against the schedule. And you could have to level resources. What are the two methods of leveling resources? Or I'm sorry, what do you do when you level resources? Do you change the critical path?
No.
Leveling resources does change the critical path. Remember, leveling resources is taking that overworked resource and extending their schedule.
Mm-hmm.
Compression does not. I'm sorry, optimization does not. You can do the what if, you can adjust progress, and utilize change control processes. And basically, the ultimate thing here is identify needs for changes. Now, the other thing here is in re-estimating, you can start over if you want. And there's a lot of estimating that basically says, we really screwed it up at the beginning, let's re-estimate. And there's some true reasons for re-estimating. Maybe your original data was messed up. You estimated based on having 5 engineers full-time, and now you only have 3 part-time, and they're all rookies. That changes your estimation. Now, what's not in this control section that is in the inputs and outputs is all those same tools that we just talked about. Compression, leveling, leads, lags, what if. Those same tools can be applied in control schedule. Now, what lane are we in? What process group are we in when we go into control schedule?
That's monitor and controlling, because it says
monitoring and controlling. And anytime you're in, anytime it says control or monitor, that's where you are. So don't miss that, please. That's an easy one to get. All right, that's it for this particular section. Let's go ahead and get our test out of the way, and then we'll take our break. Take a breath. We're going to do a 10-minute quiz on the next section. It probably starts on about page 42. Well, I don't even know for sure. We'll stop.
42?
Is it 42? Looks like we lost Tatiana, but I'm sure she said she was going to bed at 1. All right, I'm going to stop recording.